welcome back to On the Soul's Terms, and thank you very much for joining me today. And it's a pleasure to introduce the fifth house in this episode. And this is the beginning of our journey through the fifth. We will be having an interview coming out soon with Vive Oldham. She's doing a symposium or a summit at the moment, putting together a summit in the world of pleasure. And she seemed like the perfect candidate for an interview on the fifth house. And also she's a dear friend and one of my oldest friends of my adult life. So it'd be great for her to join us. And of course, we will be going into a fairy tale, which is obviously slowly building towards that episode of fairy tale exploration. But to begin with, we're going to, as we do in this series, which so far has been very informative for me personally, and I hope you're getting a lot from the series. We're going to be wandering as we do away from the previous house and into this next house. So we're moving away from that fourth house, which was all about ancestry, the hidden world, the deep layers of consciousness, the underneath world, the bottom of the sky, the imunqueli, and everything that goes on down there in the darkest place. And as we come out of this dark place, we come into quite a spectacular palace of a house, I might say. A real house of celebration and of joy. A house where we might be able to really get a sense of what we love and what we love to do, what we would desire to do no matter what outcome came of it, or what results were on the other end of it, or what we were told to do. It's just something that we would naturally like or want or desire to do in that house. It's a place of creation and recreation. And there's a deeper layer that I want to get to just before we enter. And I invite you now to really go inward into your body and just feel at this moment the beating of your own heart. Because it's in that beating of the heart and in the subtlety of the breath that we can really fully receive what is there in this particular house. In preparation for this episode, I was reading the book Dionysus by Carl Kerényi, which I happened to find in a secondhand bookstore here in Bali, in fact, which I was very surprised by. The title of the book is Dionysus, Archetypal Image of Indestructible Life. And in the introduction, he makes a distinction between the word bios in Greece and the word Zoey. Bios is where we get biography from. It's the story of your life. And in a bios, he talks about how the bios has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But Zoey is something a little deeper than that. Zoey refers to the indestructible. It refers to that life force that is there within all of us, that gives us the sense that this isn't the only time I've been here. Maybe it gives rise to concepts like reincarnation, and that I've had many bioses in this one Zoey that is underneath it all. And he talks about this in the introduction to Dionysus, because this is ultimately what Dionysus is as a god, is bringing us back to. He's bringing us back to the feeling and the sensation of something internal that is inextinguishable, a fire deep inside of ourselves that can never, ever actually go out. And I believe that this is really the heart and the soul of the fifth house. Even though it's a house that refers to romance and creativity and children and play and all these sorts of things, I think the thing that ties it together is something like the sun itself. This is the fifth house, and therefore it is the house that is related to Leo, and it's related to, therefore, the sun. The sun is the ruler of Leo. So it's images that come through like the fixed fire of Leo, like the sun itself, that day after day, it rises in the sky no matter what has gone on in the chaos of night. The sun comes back again and again, and it's something that we can really, truly rely on. And it's something internally that we can rely on as well. So that's really where I think in this episode, as we explore the fifth house, I want to point our attention and direction back so that we're not necessarily in the theories and the ideas when we're in this house. It's definitely not a house of logic, as we'll find out as we go along. It's definitely not the house of logic. In fact, it's much more of a mythic house. It involves much more of our hero's journey than it does our chronological order of events. There's something of the child in here. There's something of the playful child in us that still wants to play, even today, even no matter how old we are, whether you're listening to this at 23 years old or 85 years old or anywhere in between or above and below. There's always that inextinguishable fire inside of all of us, that child, that Peter Pan in us, the puer eternus or the puella eternus, which is the Latin for the boy, the eternal boy or the eternal girl, that isn't really interested in growing up. And that is the fifth. So we're going to enter the child's house. And the first deity that's going to meet us there is none other than Venus herself. See, Venus is in her joy in the fifth house. And if any of these the placements of the joys have made sense, this one in particular makes sense because Venus or Aphrodite is the one that really does delight in being alive and in being in love and in being in love with the world and in love with creation. And I'd like to really just invoke Aphrodite here as we get going so that she might come with us on this journey and help guide us into this house. So this is from the very beginning of the hymn to Aphrodite. And it goes like this: Muse, speak to me of the works of Aphrodite, the golden one, the Cyprian. She who awakens sweet longing in the gods and subdues the race of human beings, and the birds that fly through the air, and all the wild beasts and the many creatures that the dry land feeds, that the sea nourishes. All these love what she brings to pass, the Cytherean in her lovely crown. So that's the beginning of the story of Aphrodite, her hymn. It actually goes on to say that there are three hearts that she can neither persuade nor beguile, and talks about the three. And those three are the virgin goddesses, Athena on the one hand, who is the goddess of battle and war, Artemis on the other, the chaste goddess of the wild, and Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. So these are the only three, at least in the hymn, these are the only three that she cannot touch, which means that these are the self-contained ones, the fully self-contained ones. But Aphrodite, she doesn't want us to be self-contained. She wants us to be out in the world and out meeting people and out connecting. And so that's why she has so much joy and fun in the fifth house, because after all, this is the house of romance. In fact, it's often the romance that will take us out of our home, out of the fourth house, the romance of that first love. So it might be worth just having a feel into right now of what your experience was with that first love. Just go back to the first time, the very first time, that boy or that girl that you actually felt something and you actually acted on that something. Of course, that could go a long way back to that first crush, or maybe you held hands with somebody in primary school, or the first feeling that came up that there was another there. So this is the thing, those first four houses, they don't involve this romantic other, and it's only the fifth house that can actually open to the other. So in that romance, we may find ourselves dedicated to the muses here of poetry and art, and trying to bring all of that expression to bear into maybe our childhood poetry, or these love letters that we might have written and sealed with the kiss, or all these kinds of great expressions that we had. This is not the house of relationship, it's the house of romance. So it's the house of the high. It's the house of the infatuation or the intoxication. In a sense, it takes us back to the story of Tristan and Isolde, these two lovers from the 12th century, the troubadour myths of the 12th century, that was really well elaborated in Robert A. Johnson's book, We, W-E, We, which is a great book to check out, by the way, if you haven't read it. I think probably a lot of my audience are quite familiar with this book, but if you haven't read it, it's well worth going back to. Robert A. Johnson was one of these great Jungian analysts who was able to elaborate on stories to such a deep level, and he certainly elaborated on this one of Tristan and Isolde, took it to quite an incredible place. So in that story, we have Tristan and Isolde who kind of accidentally take this love potion. The love potion wasn't actually really meant for them. The love potion was given to Isolde so that when she met King Mark, she could take the love potion and fall in love with him, because that was her fate, that she was meant to be with King Mark. But on the ship back from Cornwall, somehow, some way, they accidentally take this love potion and fall into star-crossed lovership with each other. And it causes all sorts of chaos for the kingdom, of course, because Tristan wasn't meant to be together with Isolde. So there's this idea of the secret love and the romance, the forbidden romance. And it's an interesting one in this story of Tristan and Isolde, because we have the love potion that will run out after 3 years. So they take that love potion in, but then after 3 years, it's going to run out and they're not going to feel the same way anymore because of that love potion. So that's an interesting one when it comes to this house, isn't it? That at some point, that particular love potion wears off and we have to move with that or reinvest in that fifth house, and find ways for the high of love to infiltrate and find its way into these other houses, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. Because essentially the 5th is that first house of another set of 4, and these are the interpersonal houses. That's the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. And we'll be going through them over the next 4 months. So the 5th is that romantic, as far as relationship goes, the 5th is that first romantic hit. The 6th is when things become routined and structured into the day-to-day world. The 7th, the house of marriage, is that relationship really forming and a contractual relationship happening between the two. And then the 8th is the house of deep intimacy and sharing. And of course, that sounds like it's some kind of chronological order, but there's more like a weaving that goes in between. And I think the beauty of the 5th is it's kind of like where we have our origin story. In the 5th is the question that my longtime friend and psychotherapist Margie Templeton, she came on the show once. We discussed the story of Narcissus, which I'll actually get into a bit later today as well in this episode, because that's a bit of a 5th house myth. But she would often ask couples that she was working with, how did you meet? And in the questioning of how did you meet, she would really ascertain, like, what is their myth? What is their relationship myth? And that myth or that story of how they met is how the couple could always come back together. So in a sense, what she was doing for them astrologically is she was returning them back to the 5th. She was just giving them maybe that homeopathic dose of the love potion that they first had, that if we don't go back to it, if we don't taste that, it'll most certainly run out. And then we may become crusty and old before our time in the relationship that we're in. So that's a good one to sort of return to the 5th when it comes to the world of romance. It's like, how did you meet? And let that unfold mythically through the imagination into your origin myth. My favorite story about the origin myth comes from Marie-Louise von France, and she talks about a village somewhere in Indonesia. I can't remember exactly where that she was referring to. But when the rice wasn't growing, the villagers would go out into the mud of the rice and get down low into those rice paddies and whisper to the rice the story of rice, the origin of rice, and how rice came to be. So it's kind of like that with this, isn't it? And it's obviously not just in romance there. I think the 5th house really is the beginning of your own creative joy and your own creative essence. Like, the fifth isn't like the 10th or the top of the chart. It's not like this place where we're necessarily offering this out to the world. It's more the place that we delight in. So it doesn't necessarily have to make its way out into the world. It's this place where we just want to do those things. So, for instance, I talked to Vive about this, who's a painter and a singer and an actor, and she's all sorts of great fifth house things. And she talks about when she got her kids, which is another fifth house thing, into painting and what it was like to just like have the chaos of painting going on, and how that time that she entered through the painting with her children was like timeless time, when they became lost inside of that. Now, those paintings weren't designed so that they can maybe end up in a gallery somewhere and be sold for thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And there's not some big grand plan for this artistic endeavor. It's just art for the sake of art. It's play for the sake of play. It's joy for the sake of joy. And I think that's why Venus really delights here, Venus isn't looking to start a grand endeavor and a grand business and make all these things happen. She's not really into all of that kind of thing. More than anything, she wants time for leisure and pleasure. That's what she wants. And so she really delights in this house, because this is the house where we get to experience those things. And of course, the flip side of that is that even though I'm referring to this house as the house of all of those things, of course, a lot of this will depend on, what planets you have there and what planets you have on the cusp. And in fact, for many people, as beautiful and wonderful as all of this sounds, there tends to be a lot of blocks in the way. Even in its placement, the fifth house, as it leaves the fourth, it's a breaking away from the family script. So there can be a sense of like, I'm not sure I'm actually allowed to do this in here. And that thing that we carry from the deep place of the I can't see, of the I see, and the fourth house, that thing that we're carrying from there can really infiltrate this house and make us feel maybe shame or guilt or blame. Maybe there's stories like, I'm not allowed to have fun, I'm not allowed to have pleasure. Maybe we think it's very indulgent, or, with all of this pain and the suffering in the world, how dare I have pleasure? How dare I have fun? How dare I have that romance or that fire? And that tends to be something that really gets us. I think it's part of the human condition. In some ways you can have a look at your chart and see what's in the fifth and do all of that. But, without the chart, we can really feel also like what is in the way of me getting back to this particular energy force, remembering that it is a regenerative place. Like, this is where we regenerate. This is where we connect back to that eternal flame and our eternal fire. And so it can have such great benefits to our health and to the well-being of ourselves and then everybody around us, and feed out into the community, all these great things that are in the fifth. But instead of that, it can get very thwarted, especially in a society that has a kind of a weird relationship with pleasure, in a sense. It's either just like so forbidden on the one hand and so held back, or so overindulged in the other. It's kind of like, the difference between the dystopian Brave New World and the dystopian in 1984. In 1984, there's no fun, there's no fifth house. Everybody just has to be chained to the program of Big Brother, and just kind of like no joy, no fun. But the opposite also in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is the overindulgence and the saturation of the senses. And so nobody belongs to anybody, and everybody's having free sex, and it's all just kind of like everybody's on this drug called soma. Everybody's in this state of blissful happiness, and that's a kind of equally, if not more disturbing dystopia, to be honest, than the dystopia explored in 1984. And so we can sort of see the two ends of this, where things can get distorted, either in the complete holding back of this house and not accessing it, or in the overindulgence of it. Yeah, both of those being not really the way to do the fifth house. So yeah, I had mentioned there that Leo and the sun and shining and all this kind of thing, the lion, has that connection to the fifth. It's something that I talked about with Vive, is the stage and that fire on the stage. I found it really interesting, every time I go back to Greece and go to these beautiful sacred sites, there's always a theatre. The Oracle of Delphi, there's a theatre actually dedicated to Dionysus up there. In Epidaurus, which is dedicated to Asclepius, there's also a really beautiful amphitheatre where, the plays would happen. And so these places that are around oracle and healing, I've always found it interesting that they do have these theatres, and they also have Olympic-sized stadiums. I think both of these exist in the fifth house. The stadium, in that all these sports and games, that's really a fifth house endeavor. Competing and getting out there and showing off and showing your skills and showing your bravado against others is definitely fifth. Those with a very strong fifth house can sometimes be very good at sports and very good at being in that arena and just loving it there and wanting to compete. But also the stage. The stage is really where we really can explore ourselves and all the different components of who we are. We can play different characters. We can let loose. We can allow one part of us to really take over. And it's interesting if you are an actor or in that realm of theatre, it's really interesting how those parts are choosing you or you're choosing the parts. I remember listening to Jim Carrey talk about that and how each phase of his life was met by these different roles that he had, right up until, when he eventually did Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is kind of a great title for this fifth house episode, actually. Maybe I'll use that as the title. In that one, he was really depressed and he got the perfect role for that state of mind that he was in. So it's interesting, this connection that those in the theatre might be able to see, that strange connection with the roles that we get and the places that we are at in our lives at that particular time, and the part of ourselves that we might be exploring or getting into, and really allowing that part to step forward onto the stage of the fifth and to show itself. Because after all, this is a house that is big and bold and dramatic, not necessarily as a form of domination, but as a way of expressing and expressing something that's deep inside that just wants to come out. Because really, it's in this house that we want to be seen for what's unique. We don't want to be like everyone else. It's not a tribal house. It's very much the house of the individual. In fact, it has tension all around it in a sense, because over the other side is the 11th house. That's the house of the groups and the teams and the collective consciousness. And of course, the fifth wants to be in the individual consciousness. And just behind it is the fourth house, which is the tribe of the family. And the fifth house is trying to make it out of that. And just ahead of it is the routines and structures of everyday life. And the fifth is trying to get out of that too. So you can see it almost like the fifth is cornered at all sides and just trying to do its best to stay in the sunshine, to stay in maybe a little bit of the spotlight. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because although I get the sense of the spotlight here for sure, at the same time, it's still a night house. The sun will enter this house a few hours after sunset. So that'll really depend on what season you're in and what place you're in. But imagine that a few hours after sunset. So things have really simmered down. And so although this is a house of the bigness and the performer and all of that Leo stuff, it's an odd one. It's almost like backstage. I've wondered in the fifth whether we want to be seen or not seen. There can be a tension point between the two, given that it's a night world house. Does this want to be seen, or is it more like backstage, or is it more like, warming up or just playing for the sake of it and not really wanting to play as the performer, but just wanting to play for play? So I wonder with this, if that's also depending on the individual of whether this part wants to be seen or hidden. But it might be such a tender place inside this playful place that it actually doesn't want to be seen. It doesn't want to be scrutinized. It doesn't want to have the pressure of any kind of external thing, external eyes upon it. It just wants to perhaps be lost in its own place and its own space. So that's one to have a think about with your own fifth house or your own internal creative play. So as I mentioned with Carl Kerényi there, Dionysus is very much someone that I feel is related to this house. And if we go back to Dionysus's birth story, it's quite a good one for sort of exploring some other deeper elements of this house. So his mother, Semele, was having a love affair with Zeus and gets tricked by Hera. She gets Zeus to swear on the river Styx that he will do whatever she asks of him. And Zeus, being in the throes of a fifth house romance, just agrees to whatever it is that she wants, of course. He's loved up. He's just going to say yes. And then she says, okay, well, reveal yourself to me. And that was a trick from Hera, because Hera knew that any mortal that sees Zeus would be basically obliterated. There's no way to be able to see the god in his essential form without that being way too much for a mortal to perceive of or conceive of. So although Zeus tries to beg her not to go through with that or to take it back or to find another way, she refuses that. And so in revealing himself, she is incinerated by the brightness of his light. And all that's left is the fetus that is there, which is the baby Dionysus, because Dionysus is obviously immortal already, so he cannot be incinerated. So what Zeus does is really interesting here. He opens up his thigh and he slides Dionysus in there and then closes up his thigh. And so Dionysus ultimately is gestated inside the thigh of the father. And obviously the thigh, this is something that I was actually talking to Vive about off air. We talked about the element of Dionysus being born from the thigh, one of the biggest muscles in the body and the strongest muscles in the body, but also obviously one of the most erotic areas as in its closeness to the genitalia. And so in a sense, he's born out of that. He's born out of that eros, that erotic function. And that's really how and where he lives his life. Everywhere Dionysus goes, life is just kind of sprouting up all around him. You can sort of think of him wandering around and flowers are just growing behind his feet. And that's what he would bring to the village. So oftentimes the village is so stuck in day world consciousness, and Dionysus would pull people away from the village out into the forest. But really it wasn't just people, it was mostly women, if not all women. From what I understand, those that followed Dionysus were the women. So I have a feel into why you think that might be. There's probably many reasons for that, but maybe it was more of an oppressive world for women, and so taking them out of a system that didn't really serve them and back into the forest. And then we're imagining, of course, in the modern world, we get only the really shadow sides of this drunkenness, out of control behavior, orgies, that kind of thing. But I think what we're really talking about is this connection back to the natural world, the connection back through the senses, and the connection back to the ability to feel pleasure through music, through dancing around the fire, through stomping on the ground, and imbibing in what later became known as wine, because Dionysus was known as the god of wine. Before that, he was known in Cretan times or Minoan times as imbibing in what was called sort of like a honeyed ambrosia. This is where honey mead would come from, and partaking in this golden elixir, essentially. So I like to think about that. What was that golden elixir, and what did that put you in touch with? I think in the modern world, we think about drinking too much wine and waking up with a terrible hangover. But I think what was actually being imbibed in, it was something that like the honey, the gold of that would take you back into your heart and back into your ability to feel, wipe away all of the madness of the civilized world. And of course, meanwhile, the civilized world, ruled by Apollo, the sun god, is looking over at the Dionysian world and saying, wow, they're mad, they're crazy, they're having this crazy, awful time, they're so debaucherous and so hedonistic and what have you. But meanwhile, the Dionysian world is looking back to the Apollonic world and saying, well, what's up with those guys? They're so serious, everything's so rigid and serious, like they're barely even living over there. And that tension between Apollo's world and Dionysus's world was something that was really explored by Nietzsche in his writings as he explored that tension about the civilized and the wild. And I feel like it's a conversation that's really up now in the world, this conversation between the civilized and the wild is very much just erupting right now, I feel. We kind of know that we need to make connections back to the wild, but of course there's a danger in that because the wild can become feral if we're not able to really integrate it and work with it in a way that feels good and integrated. Yeah, it can cause chaos and it can cause destruction, of course. So Dionysus is also linked with Orpheus and Pan and these other gods, Hermes, that are less interested in keeping the status quo and more interested in bringing us back and out to nature, connecting us back to music and our longing and our desires, and essentially all of these gods that I'm referring to here come back to Aphrodite and the spell of the sensuous. As that great book by David Abrams, The Spell of the Sensuous, gets into that element of being really taken back into our animal bodies and giving our animal bodies a place in this world again. So there's something of the Dionysian world and the mystery cults that arose about that of, what are these mystery cults? It's always so difficult to know because we're not really given information about them because everybody that went through them was sworn to secrecy. But something about those mystery cults brought us out, almost like cured us of our programmed minds, brought us back to something essential, like the fifth house, brought us back to something essential of our nature, and then returned us back to the civilized world with much more joy and much more longing and much more desire to be alive. And therefore, these are often the ones that come back into the world and create beauty and art and the things that people really admire and love for generations and generations to come. And speaking of that word generation, I think that's another word that really gets us connected to the fifth house, because it is the house of children. And of course, that can literally mean your children, the children that you have, the procreation. But it can also mean, or maybe more succinctly or more accurately, mean the children is in your creations and what you long to create and what you want to create. And therefore, it's a generative force or regenerative force. It's like where we go back to restore the life force, where we go back to that essential eros, and where we go back to what, as I said before, Carl Kerényi calls the indestructible life. We can perhaps remember what it's like back there to be born and to be reborn. And I think this is the house of rebirth. In some ways, every house that's after a water house is that. So the fifth house is that. We'll get into that of the ninth, because in the ninth, we'll be coming out of the underworld. And the first house, we're coming out of the dissolution. So we're coming into life again. But the fifth is like, it's a little different because it's the kind of rebirth that really gets us in touch with something of the essential self, something of our spirit, something of perhaps our daimon. Even though I talked about that in the first house, it's like, this is where the first house is like, this is your mask, this is your persona, work with this. The fifth house, we can really mix it up. We can say like, I'm going to try that persona on, but I'm also going to try this persona on, and I'm going to really work, I'm going to experiment with things and then find out who I really am just by trying out a lot of different elements. So you might be able to also hear that this is the house of the inner child, of which, of course, much of psychotherapy has spent a lot of time focusing on and exploring. That is that creator, the player, the dreamer, the one deep inside that probably still wants to create and play and dream. But also, as anyone that's done any of that inner child work and gone to visit the inner child, there's often the feeling of maybe that they were told they're too loud or too silly or too much. Maybe they were ostracized or kept out or not chosen. And so we can find that little one inside of ourselves that is hiding away, that doesn't want to come out, that ultimately is in that state that we talked about before, the one who is wanting to be seen and not wanting to be seen at all. So there's a complexity with this child down here and how to make contact with him or her and how to connect again with that part of oneself. Sometimes this is the child that had to grow up too fast or had to caretake when they were young, or, had to maybe put the money on the table too early, or had to get to work, or even felt these sensations like they had to get to work, or they had to grow up, or they had to take care of everybody else's needs but their own. So you can see, therefore, that this house has a lot of potential for healing, in the sense of how do we allow ourselves to really care for ourselves rather than chastise that one. See it in therapy quite a lot, where that child is being chastised and told that it shouldn't be there, or that the internal voice is still judging this part and still ostracizing this part and still leaving it out of the game. It's kind of like those kids when you're choosing a team and you're sort of like the last one to be chosen. Sometimes the child can feel like that. And it can be a complicated process of getting this child to play again, because that silliness or that dreaming can lead to all this chaos. And, the adult self can find that very destabilizing and like, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to bring that back. But what we resist persists, as they say, and definitely that stuff that we repress will find its way back into our life sometimes at some point. And so maybe that'll be the midlife, the sports car and and that kind of thing happens. This child sort of comes in and takes over, maybe the inopportune moment. So rather than allowing that to happen, maybe better to get in touch with this child so they don't commandeer the vehicle at the wrong moment of life. Yeah, so I also want to talk about fifth house wounds and what that first heartbreak is like. Heartbreak is a form of initiation, and I think all of us, each one of us, have to go through it. And when was that first heartbreak for you? Worth just having a feel into that, because of course that early love has a little bit of the tragedy to it, where we want it to work out so much, and the feelings are so big because we have nothing to compare it to. So it can feel like fifth house sunshine stuff, like it's the whole universe occurring at once, and we can have that big dream shattered by heartbreak. It's that vulnerability. How do we re-enter and not become kind of like what happens for Hercules when he has his heartbreak? Part of Hercules' heartbreak is that he manages to wrestle with this great lion and have this intimate wrestling match with the lion, and then bring back the pelt of the lion to Eurystheus, who's the king. And Eurystheus just rejects him and is grossed out. He's disgusted by this lion. And he tells him to get out and not bring anything back here again, not bring anything into the kingdom again. Any other task that he finishes, he should just leave outside the doors. And then Eurystheus hides himself in a glass jar or a brass jar underneath the floor, basically, and hides there. And in that rejection, Hercules puts on the lion's mane, which has impenetrable skin, and ties the feet of the lion in front of his heart. So that can be sometimes like this heartache and this heartbreak. It can feel like the whole world is collapsing when we have our first loss, our first loss of love. And maybe with Venus in her joy here, Venus isn't just love. Venus also comes with a companion loss. And I wonder how we have worked with that loss, if we've been able to grieve that loss, if we've been able to grieve the loss of the things that we really loved, or even our creations, or even our children, or even those that we felt so deeply connected to. And are we able to, have we done this? Have we done what Hercules has done and put the impenetrable skin or pelt on top of us so that we can be safe but not fully alive? It's a risk down here in the fifth. And we need to be able to feel that when that is happening, and maybe revisit some of the old wounds and do some cleaning up and some hygiene down there so that our fifth can regenerate itself yet again. The last mythic territory that I want to go to is the story of Narcissus. Because really, fifth house love is a bit of a narcissistic love. And I think that's okay. I think there's a beauty to that if we can see what it is that is really happening, that we are falling in love with ourselves, and that has a positive element to it. It's interesting because we think of Narcissus and narcissism, and most people, when they think of narcissism, they think of someone that's just self-obsessed. But of course, in the myth, Narcissus didn't know himself. That was the prophecy at the beginning of his life. His mother received a prophecy that he would live a long life so long as he never knows himself. And so he was kept away from all reflection. which, mythically speaking, he was kept away from all relating and relationship. So he had suitors, male and female, that would come from everywhere and try it on with him. And he kept saying, no, no, no. An echo came. She didn't have her voice. And she tried it on and could only repeat back what he said. And eventually gets rejected from him too. Until one of these suitors, which happens to be a male suitor, was so put off by being rejected by Narcissus that he calls down Nemesis. And he says, may Narcissus fall in love with one that he cannot have. And then Nemesis heard that prayer and put the curse upon Narcissus. And then Narcissus, when he sees his reflection in the river or the lake, he doesn't know what it is that he's seeing. He doesn't know that he's witnessing himself because he's been protected from this reflection his whole life by his mother. And so when he sees this, he doesn't know that he's looking at himself. And so it ensues that, when he's happy, the reflection is happy. Then when he's sad, the reflection disappears because of the tears. Then he becomes angry and he sees an angry face and he doesn't know why it's angry, why this reflection is angry. And he essentially just loses himself in these throes of this big dramatic romance. And I think that's in some ways the risk. But what is it that is the actual risk in the fifth house? It's not necessarily the romance itself. It's this other element of the prophecy that Narcissus doesn't know himself. That was in the prophecy at the beginning. His mother protects him from ever knowing himself so that he can live a long life. Like the Pythia has the forked tongue, the double meaning that when he does see himself, that's when he actually falls to his own death and destruction. So he doesn't know himself. And really, although this is a house of play and creativity and romance and all of those things, I think underneath the story of the fifth is where we began. And that's in that heartbeat and that indestructible force that's at the center of the soul, which we might actually call the spirit. And I think above and beyond all things that the fifth house represents, it is the process of individuation. It is the first place where we get the chance to become our actual self. And we have to go into that journey through the realm of the body, through the realm of pleasure, and through the realm of loving, not the world around us first up, but by loving ourselves. And as cliched as that sounds, because I can't believe how cliched it sounds when I'm saying it, that really is the point of the fifth. To love oneself, and to love oneself so fully that that love permeates out and can be shared with the others around that you might meet in this fifth house. So thank you for joining me for that exploration of the fifth. And for our next episode, I will be, as I said, having a chat. I've already had the chat. I'm looking forward to bringing it to you. A beautiful and enlivening chat with Vive Oldham, who was literally called Vive. So she really is a fifth house creature, a fifth house person. And Vive and I discuss everything going on around the summit that she's bringing forward, that's around pleasure and around bringing ourselves back to our body. Vive is into all of this beautiful mythic Jungian stuff. She practices the Marion Woodman lineage, which has resulted in this beautiful practice called body dreaming, which really takes people into their interior world and works through a lot of the stuff that's going on, very much aligned with my work with process-oriented psychotherapy. And we have a really beautiful and enlivening conversation, and I look forward to seeing you there. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the fifth, and I would implore you to do something today after listening to this episode that you just love to do, that you just want to do, and that just gives you a lot of pleasure and a lot of joy in your life. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.